Hello, and welcome to another episode of New Kinship, where we talk about many fun topics, especially as it relates to where we find belonging in ethnicity, sexuality, community, and related topics. I'm one of your co-hosts, David Frank.
And hi, I'm TJ.
Today's episode is just a conversation with TJ and I. We've been really wanting to dig into some topics a little more in depth, and today's topic are the 7 myths of Side A. Side A is the kind of theological position in Christianity of affirming gay marriage or gay sexual relationships within marriage, typically. By contrast, TJ and I would ascribe to Side B, which is the theological position in Christianity that holds to a traditional or historical Christian sexual ethic, that gay marriage or sexual relationships is not God's design for us, but that sex is intended for heterosexual marriage, while still validating the redemptive opportunities within queer SSA experiences and lives. TJ wanted to do this episode kind of being provoked by a YouTube video. What was it, source, TJ?
There was a podcast called I've Tried to Be Straight. It's a Side A podcast. I think it started in the last year, maybe. But
okay.
I noticed when watching it, I was watching an episode with a psychologist named Julie Sadesky, and I noticed that these people, they're still operating on certain myths around what Side B is, or what Side B thinks, or sort of assumptions of Side B. And I think that's intrinsically problematic because different positions should be able to charitably represent well the other positions, right? And I get that Side A is sort of dominant, like the U.S. culture likes Side A broadly more than they would like Side B. So in some way, sometimes the dominant groups don't care what more minority groups think. But in principle, to be charitable, they should be able to understand what Side B is talking about. Otherwise, in any sort of disagreement between the two sides, they're just making straw men. They're just making false positions that Side B doesn't hold. And I admit some of the differences at the level of assumption. So it's contention over the best assumptions, you know? But I think we should talk about it. I'm hoping this will be useful to people who are actually Side A to maybe, help sharpen their perspective on what Side B is. But also maybe useful to people who are trying to discern between maybe Side A and Side B about, what is a path of life for them. So
yeah, we've had a handful of interviews with different friends who are Side A. So in some senses, this might be what we would. Well, maybe it's not just what we would say. There's a lot more we could say if we were interviewed on a different podcast. But yeah, we want to hit at some of these underlying myths, and some of them might also be looping different logical fallacies around how people are reasoning. Mm-hmm. So let's jump in. Myth number 1. Celibacy is sexual repression or misery. To define terms here, we mean celibacy as the practice of sexual abstinence, typically lifelong, but generally at the very much outside of a marital relationship. So basically, the concept here is to live without sex would just is awful. And it requires repressing your sexuality. I am very understanding. I think maybe most people, maybe especially most Christians in general, probably felt like growing up and trying to be good with their sexuality felt like sexual repression at any point. So I think it's really easy for people to be like, oh yeah, like we need sexual repression is bad. And this is a tangent of how much of this is just a natural part of growing up, and that unless you have really good parents who are coaching you through your puberty, the natural impulse for a lot of youth is just to repress these new feelings and new experiences of sexuality. Anyways, but on specifically this point, I think the quote that you pulled from one of these interviews where people are declaring sadness, shame, drama is not God's path for you.
In relation to
which we agree.
Yeah.
But the kind of myth is that celibacy means sadness, celibacy means shame, celibacy means drama. How do you respond, TJ?
I have a complex relationship to this because celibacy is often for me seen, not often, but sometimes seen closer to misery in a certain way. But I tend to assume that is because contemporary societies, at least in the US where I am now, they do not have space for different forms of life beyond just marriage. So if you're not married, then kinship is uncertain. You don't know, you don't get the prestige of having like being seen as adults. Like you don't have the prestige of being seen like you reached the way humans should be. You also don't have, just beyond marriage, you don't have sometimes access to the resources that are available, like insurance maybe. Insurance may be more complicated. You might have a harder time having someone to pick you up from the airport. You just have those basic economic sort of activities or support. You don't have them. And that makes people more miserable, all of those different aspects, right? So there's a big question over um, I assume this is me. My assumption is that celibacy is complicated. It's hard for a lot of people generally, but it's really different being hard in a context where there's actual possibilities and support and frameworks for humans to live life beyond just marriage versus a society or context where there's no support of any other opportunity really. And to not be married is to not have kinship, is to not have common economic supports, and is to not have the prestige of having like you reach somewhere as a good human being.
So when people are bringing up this objection to side B of like celibacy,
Mm-hmm.
you're just repressing your sexuality,
Mm-hmm.
I think both of us and many other side B siblings have been told like, oh, you're just still repressing yourself because you haven't truly accepted yourself. Because if you would have truly accepted yourself, you would be
Me
in
said
a,
it. Yeah, me
same
said it.
sex relationship.
Sexual relationship.
You've been naming a lot of economic life stability things that we might connect to the idea of kind of this partnership, of a stable partnership in life. How much do you think people are feeling that of like, oh, celibacy is miserable because of loneliness versus celibacy is miserable because of sexual repression or sexual, loss?
I think they're definitely analytically different.
I'm just wondering what percentage of people do you think are processing this kind of
Mm-hmm.
myth that celibacy is bad for you, more or
Mm-hmm.
less? And, at least some people will sometimes describe it as forced celibacy or, some form of
Mm-hmm.
obligation in it. Are they thinking through it mainly through the sexual lens? Do you think it's 50-50, or do you think it's more weighted on the sexual side on this idea of like why celibacy is not good for people?
I think in a contemporary society in the US, yeah, I think it's more on sexual fulfillment is seen as a human good that human beings need to achieve. But I will say in other contexts, like in my African context, it's the idea that someone who's not married can not be channeling their sexual energy rightly, and it messes up society. Like they're like undomesticated or untamed or something, and they're more likely to cause problems, like getting random ladies pregnant or something, or getting pregnant by a man out of just kind of casually or randomly. I'm just talking about why celibacy is seen as sexual repression or misery. Sorry. Yeah. There's a lot of dynamics. I mean, you can't. It takes a long time to delineate all the dynamics. But I tend to assume, like I said, the in the U.S. it's about sexual fulfillment. Sexual fulfillment is seen as good, and you can draw some sort of arguments based on biological or psychological benefits around sex. And then if you're not getting it, why? Why are you not doing it? So yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
it's hard for a lot of people too to be celibate. Like I think not it's not I don't think that's a controversial idea. It's difficult for many people. So yeah.
mhm. I was talking with a friend and listener, and
Mm-hmm.
they were talking about how this myth around like, oh, how could we like push, encourage celibacy for a whole swath of people who experience same-sex attractions predominantly. And they said in their 20s it was a big hang up, but now they're in their 30s. They just know a lot of celibate single Christian women
Mm-hmm.
who had their straight,
Mm-hmm.
who had really hoped for marriage. And life hasn't turned out that way.
Yeah.
And so this is like, isn't a gay person problem. It's that there's a lot of people who don't get married. And if celibacy is just like the worst thing ever, then these people would have miserable lives, but they've actually are really thriving and need, I mean, need a vision for what, why they're not deficient, maybe, or like maybe they don't
Mhm.
need it, but like the church does. Okay, let's keep moving. Myth number 2, as people are, this kind of, the myth goes like this. Back when the Bible was written, the writers of the Bible at that time, especially the Apostle Paul, couldn't imagine consensual same-sex monogamy.
Mhm.
And so now that in our more recent century-ish, that people have said, hey, same-sex relationships, they're not just pederastic, they're not abusive, they're not
Mhm.
just flings of, sexual deviance, but these are actually people who are really seeking to love each other well,
Yeah.
who are committed to each other, who are supporting one another, being faithful sexually. It's a whole different ballgame from what the Bible writers were talking about when they were talking about same-sex sexual activity. Thus, when the Bible talks about it, it really doesn't apply to what we're talking about today.
Mhm. That's one of the most common side arguments. Yeah. So
Why would you say that that is probably a myth?
I think that we have enough historical arguments and evidence that a lot of, even from Plato's work, the Symposium, and Apostle Paul, there was people on that Mediterranean basin, ancient Near East sort of area, but they had some idea that some people pursued consensual same-sex monogamy, and not these versions that we now consider like too much of an age gap or abusive, but just sort of relatively egalitarian same-sex consensual monogamous relationships. Um, and that can be lots. We have arguments. We have evidence. Even though, of course, the evidence is argued about because this is one of the central planks of a side A account.
Can I read this quote from N.T. Wright?
Yeah, go ahead.
N.T. Wright says, as a classicist, I have to say that when I read Plato's Symposium, or when I read the accounts from the early Roman Empire of the practice of homosexuality, then it seems to me they knew just as much about it as we do. In particular, a point which is often missed, they knew a great deal about what people today would regard as long-term, reasonably stable relations between two people of the same gender. This is not a modern invention. It's already there in Plato. Plato's about, is it 3,500 years before Jesus?
It was 350 years between Plato and Jesus.
Yeah, sorry, I added a zero.
Yeah.
Um, so Plato is about 350 years prior uh, to Jesus. So N.T. Wright continues, today's idea is that for Paul, it was always a matter of exploitation of younger men by older men or whatever. Of course, there was plenty of that then, as there is today, but it was by no means the only thing.
Mm.
So N.T. Wright, yeah, is a classicist. He reads these old texts all the time. And that
Mhm.
quote is actually from an article by John Pike. We'll link it in
Mhm.
the show notes, which is a longer discussion of both. And there's some historians who say, "Oh, I don't think there is," but a lot of other historians who are disagreeing and saying, "No, I think," who are more or less on the same page as N.T. Wright.
Yeah.
So we encourage you guys to go and look up the examples. It's accessible and it's not that long of a read. Like you don't have to,
Yeah.
go buy a whole new book.
It's a
Another
short essay.
article we'll link to is um, Press and Sprinkle, where
Mhm.
it's a specific point that Matthew Vines, he often brings up this myth as well, that because Matthew Vines is very committed to wanting to interpret and follow the scriptures as it is. And so he follows along this line of argument that Paul is more or less talking about pederasty or potentially cult worship and kind of, yeah, various forms of sexual exploitation or deviance that don't map on to what we're talking about today.
In the-
And Preston Sprinkle responds. So that was, I remember it being very striking when I was just reading Plato's Republic and came across Plato talking about, yeah, two guys just loving each other so much they just never want to separate from each other. Like we have the, this kind of just idea of like love is love, and that like Plato was talking about love back then. It's not a new, it's not so new. So that's the myth. I think it is pretty, I think it's been debunked. Matthew Vine still disagrees with me. Encourage you guys to go look into it yourselves. But let's move on to myth 3.
Mhm.
Marriage is the only form of committed kinship, or potentially the only form of a committed covenant. So this
Mm.
is a myth that is very dominant in
So
a
dominant.
lot. How much of the world? Like mostly America, or do you think it's pretty has expanded its way
I
in
don't
a lot
know.
of
That's
other
hard.
cultures as
The
well?
second one is hard. I would not say yes to that exactly, but
But
it's
definitely
somehow,
in our kind of Euro-American context of,
yeah, so much.
and I would say a lot of Christianity, this really ties together with that first of like, well, why is celibacy, potentially so miserable?
Hmm.
And it's like, well, marriage is the only way for you to have a
A good
committed
life. Like,
form of
yeah, like flourish. It's the only sort of
like
kinship you can
someone
possibly
someone
have.
who is
Yeah.
going to love you and stand by you till, like
Yes.
through thick and thin. And
Hmm.
so they're like, why would you want to keep people from that?
Yeah.
Um,
Why keep them from a good? It's such an obvious good. Why would you keep them from it? Yeah. That's
so
the idea.
TJ, what are some alternative ways that people might really stick by each other through thick and thin and not be left to fend for themselves?
Covenant sisterhood, godparenthood. We can talk about lay monastic communities. We can talk about age cohort groups. We can talk about monastic life, monastic communities. We can talk about cenobitic monastic communities, which are groups of people living together. We can talk about, this one's a little bit different, but eremitic, so that's all eremitic monastic communities, which are like usually a hermit, but sometimes they connected with other hermits occasionally around. Hermits are a little bit different, but still some sort of, there's commitment there in some ways of kinship. There's also human associations like fraternities, kind of, but not fraternities in the university sense in the US, but like associations that people are always involved in. There could be committed friendship that's not covenant brotherhood or sisterhood, but it's like a lesser version of making in. There's lots of ways. And everything I say is like an abstract idea. Each cultural context is going to implement them in different ways. There's like a variety of the same type of thing generally. But there's so many. And for some reason, is a long history and I don't know it all, but like Protestantism that emerged in the US kind of started bringing a monoculture of kinship around the world. And it was just like marriage is like this one monoculture. It's like only planting corn on your field, you know? And it became the only thing. And that's not healthy for agriculture. And that's not healthy for humans either. So yeah, there's lots of other forms, but people don't know it. People they've often forgotten about it because they're a few generations removed from future things, or they're in traditions which don't remember them, like Protestantism doesn't remember monasticism usually. But good job, Catholics and
Uh,
Orthodox for continuing it. But yeah.
so I live in a, covenant community house. You have
Mm-hmm.
some covenant brothers.
Mm-hmm.
In in what way do those relationships kind of step into what people might be like think is missing out if you're not married?
Mm-hmm. Well, in my case, it's not the same as your version of your covenant community, but economic support, places, I always have a place to live, like stay if I want or live if I want. I always have people to pick me up from the airport. I always have people who cook for me if I want them to cook for me. I always have people who I can ask for money if I want it. I have people who I can intentionally like want to, if I want to work together on something with them, I have people who already will work together with me on something, which is kind of like life projects, you know? I always have people to go to parties with if I want to. I have people who defend me. I have people who will encourage me to pursue the virtues. I have people who will for
You're such an
my
Enneagram
my sake.
6.
I know, don't remind me. I will argue for my honor in public spaces, like all those things. So yeah, I definitely have that. So it's some marriage in the U.S. conception often covers those things. So I have that as well in a
Hmm.
different relationship.
Yeah. I think for those who are really feeling the transience of life and relationships, I think a lot of people look to coupling as incredibly, or like there, a lot of examples you gave are more communal based,
Yeah.
and which I'm a big fan of because a lot of those goods are also available to me through people who, yeah, we're bound together even if there's some movement of who's part of the community at different times.
You have to tell us how your covenant community brings about some of these similar goods to marriage, because it's not the same as covenant brotherhood. It's different. It's related, but not the same.
For me, so much, for my personal experience has a lot to do around just with household life of like I just have a much higher baseline level of happiness and connection and
Yeah.
stability in my life because I live in a household that's integrated where we have rhythms of eating, cooking, shopping, cleaning, prayer together that supports like, emotional, mental, spiritual, physical health. These things are all connected. And so to be part of a
Mhm.
household that is supporting those things just makes me not be like a leaf on the wind,
Yeah.
which I'd be more prone to be if
Yeah.
I
Also,
otherwise.
I've seen your household obviously, but people who pick you up from the airport if you need it. You have people that come home too, like people that just talk about your day if you feel so
I have
inclined.
emergency
Yes.
contacts who are like, well, it makes sense. We've
Yeah.
been living in the household together for multiple
Yeah.
years. You're going to be
Your
here.
emergency contacts. Like, yeah, it's
Um,
definitely one way to cover some of the just kinship needs of a person that are
yeah.
not via the particular kinship type of marriage. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
I will say that because of this monoculture on marriage, it has created a lot of pressures around coupling. Think about like a wedding invite and you get a +1. And it's
Yeah.
always assumed that that's romantic.
Mm,
Maybe you've had people like, oh, I'm going to bring my friend instead, and like,
yeah.
oh, that's different. But you're like, oh, yeah, that's cool. That's cool. People don't have to have romantic. You can bring friends. And
Mm,
so hopefully we're seeing movement towards, again, like other significant others in people's lives. But there's a lot of pressure around coupling and these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So myth 3, you don't have to be lonely or detached or even uncoupled, unsupported if you don't get married. There are
yeah.
other ways to
Surprise.
bond yourself with other people, and all of these
Mm-hmm.
take work.
Yeah.
It's just no
Yeah,
easy
they'll take
boat.
work.
I just think of the disciples when Jesus is like, hey, Moses gave you, kind of permission for divorce, but that's because your hearts were hard. It's really not, plan A. And they're like, if that's the case, it'd be better not to get married at all. Like this idea of like lifelong commitment to one person, the disciples were like, that seems kind of unbearable. What so it's just an interesting other side of the coin.
Mm,
Myth 4. This one's maybe not a myth. Will
it's complicated.
um, it goes something like this: European Christianity has largely spread through colonialist forces, and as part of its these colonialist encounters in many spaces, if not all spaces, has caused homophobia. It has produced by the spreading of morality against same-sex relationships, same-sex sexual
Insects. Yeah.
relationships. It has caused a hardness on gay people and queer people. There's parallel arguments around trans people as well. And they're saying this is actually a fault in the European Christian tradition and the
Mhm.
harm that it has caused across the globe. Is this a myth?
It's complicated. I my I think about this somewhat a lot. This idea. Some human cultures, and come talk with me if you want to talk about more examples. But some human cultures were also not pro same-sex sex, right? It's not distinctively just Christian. We can talk about the Jews. We can talk about Muslims. We can also talk about the Stoics. They thought same-sex sex was deviant. We can also talk about
So that'd
I know
be
some
like The Stoics are a line of
The
philosophers, and
Greco-Roman
they're
Greco-Roman community of philosophers, yeah. And pre-Christian, and
so
not
on one
Jewish.
level we could say this is a myth in that it's not totally true. It's not, there aren't any other examples of cultures throughout the world that didn't like
Yeah,
same-sex
same-sex
sex.
sex was not. Some of them thought it was deviant. Some of them thought it was desirable. That doesn't mean,
Yet,
though, that European Christianity and maybe other types of Christianity too did not cause some issue for queer people or gay people due to hardness of heart. And I think we can see some of those examples on the African continent, in the US, in Europe, in other places, South America, Central America. Yeah. And so it's this complicated thing. Yeah. There's more to say, but it's
so what you're saying is that there is a real history of, even in some cultures, that either it was actually accepted and
Mhm.
fairly normal, or potentially it was maybe seen as unusual, but it wasn't like that big of a deal.
Mhm.
Christianity came in and either overturned and directly contradicted some of the cultural
Yeah.
mores and patterns of the community, or intensified any discomfort that they had and
Mhm.
created societies. And now, yeah, some would say that, yeah, most of Africa is very homophobic, is very against
Mhm.
same-sex sexual relationships because of the influence of Christianity, and that that's not
Yeah.
actually something indigenous to these African
Yeah.
communities.
I think that's often true that we just said. It's often it's particular types of Christianity. It's like evangelical Pentecostal types of Christianity more than maybe
Mm.
others. I mean, we talked about this in a previous episode. I talked about essentially what we might call trans people in Ethiopian Orthodox regions in the past. Back then, from the data we have, it was they're seen as different and abnormal in a certain sense, but they're part of society. People aren't gonna cause them issue. But in contemporary Ethiopia, from my understanding, trans people don't have an easy life. Like there's been less respect given, less they don't their dignity is not respected as much anymore because of contemporary politics of anti-homosexuality, anti-trans stuff, anti-trans like life.
So
So
this
yeah.
one, we still included it because depending on how strongly people believe or state this myth, it's only
Mhm.
like 10% myth, but maybe
Yeah, it's
90%
complicated.
kind of true. But
Yeah.
maybe less, while it's not so much of a myth, there is a fallacy at play in this logic of just,
Mhm.
oh, if Christianity had this influence, even if it was, as TJ said, kind of a moral that's then it being imposed through the hardness of human hearts, and then, you know, coming out and causing more harm than just a moral standard
Mhm.
necessitates. There's this fallacy that indigenous is somehow right.
Yeah. They're
That,
automatically compared to the evil Christians who came in, or
yeah,
that they all
and
did not have things we most people condemn now as sexually like sexually bad. It could include rape, or it could include sexual engagement with minors, or we call them minors now. It could include lots of things. So yeah.
yeah, so there's just this, for those to whom this kind of reality of colonialist pressures of morality, or they're either imposed or just influenced because they're the new rulers, they're the wealthy people, whatever it may be, they're the ones who are
Mhm.
bringing the good news. Whatever reasons that these colonialists have more influence,
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that everything that they're bringing is evil, or that it was always brought in evil ways.
Mhm.
It's always complicated,
Mhm.
for
And there's more to
sure.
say on this
But
topic too. I'll just say that needs to be a lot longer conversation on this topic. Yeah, it's complicated.
yeah,
It's a fine preliminary statement. It's complicated.
but at some level, like, cultures will always clash with their morals.
Mhm.
And there is no version of reality in which there's some indigenous core moral culture of an ethnic community that never changes over time.
Yeah.
Like cultures are constantly interacting, learning from each
Mhm.
other, evaluating what creates better goods in the
Mhm.
community.
Mhm.
I know at times those who go really hard on just kind of this mono lens around anti-colonialism will start to do this kind of, maybe we can call it an indigenous idolization. And we both really care about roots and reconnecting and
Yeah.
honoring indigenous cultures that still
Mhm.
exist, and even what roots that we all hold in our own bodies and families. But to simply say that that means that the morality around same-sex sex is wrong, like you can't jump to that, because then you'd have to, the knife would cut both ways, and you'd have to start saying that around the morality around murder and other things that might have been common in certain cultures.
Mhm. Mhm. It's not to say.
Okay, next
It's also
myth.
called. It's also, before you continue, it's also called the myth of the noble savage. So anyone who knows that might also know that myth. But yeah, can I see
Okay.
this next one for this myth? The next one is that sex or sexual ethics is just a personal decision, and it's not communal or religious. And I'm the one who talked about this one in particular in our planning for this episode, because when I went to QCF, which is an conference for Christians, they're kind of side A, side double A predominantly, but a few side B people attend. They define side B as side B is making a personal, private decision to be celibate. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, no, 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 no. I am not side B because I made a personal, private decision to be celibate, or at least that's not the first thing. And if, okay, I am side B because I actually think it's the normative design of God for what sex and marriage are for. And it's an outgrowth of faithfulness to his gospel. Me, TJ, I would not make a personal, private decision just to be celibate just because for no reason. You know what I mean? Like I would not choose that just because it's not what I would desire in most other, not how my desires flow. But I do it to follow God and honor God. And by the QCF people constructing side B as this personal and private decision, is his attempt to make an ethical political framing to remove side B's edge, like the edge of the ethical political critique of what side B is trying to say, that we need to honor God with our bodies. And that honoring God with our bodies includes some ways that we live out ourselves as sexual beings. And that includes walking with the gospel of the living God, and same-sex sex is off the table for a faithful disciple. That's what it is. So I have very little sympathy for this construction of it being like a personal private decision, because truly it's attempting to, it's not a hermeneutic of charity. It's just trying to frame us in their way to make us domesticated or tamed, and try to avoid the critique that we actually have for how to live a faithful life. So that's me. That's what I think about that. And I have no sympathy towards it if you have not realized. So,
Another way that could be said is, that at least this aspect of sexual ethics is relatively relativistic, and people just make their own personal decisions, and that's what's most important, is living according to your conscience. And it is really important to operate by our conscience and to do these things. But
and I fully
I'm on the
construct this.
same
This is
page that the
also
gospel,
okay. Go ahead.
that the good news of Jesus is that there is a king who is going to bring times of refreshing, and is going to bring times where wrong things are set right. And there's just a deep humility that sometimes our hearts want wrong things, and that there's an edge to that requires dying to ourselves. And it's not something that we're not ashamed of that.
Yeah. I also have to say you can deconstruct this also by just talking about how they're elevating American cultural values of individualism and private choice. like just the movement of your personal private will or something, rather than the recognition that human beings are social creatures, and our morality and our ethics they're social, they're not just personal, and they're not individualistic. So, anyways, there's a lot more to this. Is like there's prior assumptions,
Hmm.
prior cultural values assumptions that make some people say this. So, yeah.
That's why one of my favorite, in a sense, sexual ethics works is Wendell Berry's Sex Community
Oh yeah,
Economy. Oh, I'm missing a word in there.
I know book. It's a good
Because it
one.
really got me out of my individualistic lens
Uh-huh.
and started thinking about what sex means in community.
Yeah,
um,
he's a
and
prophet.
just really starting to feel that, like, oh, we're connected. Like the sexual autonomy that we see in Friends and Sex in the City, like,
Uh-huh.
doesn't work in actual community. And
Yeah,
probably argued probably doesn't work well in those TV shows often, but
it just works well for wealthy elites because they have the resources to like play around. You know what I mean? But for human
yeah.
beings in general, it doesn't work. So
Anyway, that's just on a base ethical level. Obviously, we're not saying that every side A person is arguing for playing around.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
it's true.
though it's not, it is polyamory is increasingly part of the conversation here, both committed forms of it and less committed forms of it.
Yeah, that's true.
And actually, that maybe begins to move us to the next myth.
Mhm.
Is that right?
Yeah, number 6.
I don't know a tight way to name this, but it connects with this deep sentiment, I think, in the American conscience of, like, love is love. Like, if
Mhm.
someone's having sex not because they're just like full of lust and objectifying them, but they actually genuinely care about that person and want to have a meaningful bond with them, want to, you know, have good mutual pleasure.
Mhm.
How could that be immoral? How could that be something that you say is bad? And on that surface, it'd be like, well, yeah, none of those things inherently are wrong. Like,
Mhm.
we should be engaging each other as, some people say, like, as subjects rather than as objects. We should be
Mhm.
not despising the body and the various ways that we can find delight. But, these two people, you see a picture of them together and they're deeply in love, and you're like, oh, that's so cute. So, yeah, like a guy and a gal, and super cute. But then if you, like, zoom out the photo and you're like, wait, that guy's wife is in the background. Like, he's committing adultery right now, even if he feels all these good things and it's very mutual with this woman. Like, there's obviously other pieces. This gets into Wendell Berry, but it's this myth of, like, the supreme goodness of sexual affection and love,
Mhm.
and that, like, you can't say no to it. But as soon as you start thinking about, I think you begin to see, because you can't just follow that wherever it goes.
Yeah.
So maybe the myth is more so just at the heart of what this conversation of what side A is saying, kind of tried and true side A, that sexual affection and intimacy between any two people who are in a committed lifelong relationship, aka that's how people think of what marriage is, even
Mhm.
though there's actually other lifelong committed relationships.
Yeah, yeah.
But in that context, especially a monogamous, just a couple, a pair,
Mhm.
that's where it's okay. That's where sex can be expressed.
Mhm.
And that's the side A position, and so that's where I guess this whole episode is saying, well, we think that belief is a myth, and people have to start using these, different arguments or different reasonings that we've mentioned before
Mhm. I'm going to say
to.
you touched this a little bit, but that one also touches what is marriage for, what is sex for, like these prior questions. Because if you answer those prior questions, then this makes less sense. Sort of the articulation that you're saying, like it's just because we love each other, we want to have pleasure together. Like if that's what marriage is, if that's what sex and marriage is for, then that's a very different version of what sex and marriage are for than other versions, and than the Christian version, I
Yeah.
would say as well. So
And that's
Yes.
where this knife that cuts both ways. Increasingly, I do see more straight Christians realizing that it's not sufficient to just say marriage is for a man and a woman,
Mm-hmm.
because then you're just like,
Why? Why is
without doing that deeper thinking, because then you're just like,
yeah.
oh yeah, it just feel kind of mean.
Yeah. I mean, like,
Like
why
these
are we
people get
preventing people from having like committed love? Because committed love
yeah.
is due. So
If
why do you
marriage is
prevent that?
for committed love and plus some sexual fun,
Yeah.
um,
You know,
it's
plus some
kind of
support.
mean to keep that, in only certain situations.
Yes.
But if sex is bigger than that,
Mhm.
and if marriage is bigger than that,
Yeah.
then it starts actually putting a lot of people's marriages in question to say, hey, did you get married just because you wanted some lifelong partnership and sexual fun?
Yeah.
Well, that's actually like not the fullest version of what marriage
Sure.
is for.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've shared on the podcast before, but a married friend who was saying like, oh, when we moved from like having sex that was just like we enjoyed each other as husband and wife
Mhm.
to like wanting to have a baby together
Yeah.
and really having that shared goal. It was this whole new experience of what sex was and
Mm.
what it meant for us to be part of it, and it was this deeper level of engaging in sex. And yeah, I just thought that was really kind of existentially interesting to hear, as their marriage began to look beyond themselves,
Yeah.
which is inherently, I think, what part of that like procreative aspect of sex is supposed to be
Yeah.
tied into, which is part of why the same sex is breaking this mold that God set up to where sex naturally draws a husband and wife beyond themselves
You need.
in ways that's not possible in a non-procreative relationship.
Yeah. True.
So that's,
I mean,
anyways, that's some of the like design thinking behind sex and
yes.
marriage specifically united in the ways that they are, not
Yeah.
just for love
Can I do the seventh
generally.
one? The seventh one and
Yeah.
finally. So I'm gonna say, and I actually see this myth sometimes around side B people, the way occasionally, which I think is problematic, but I see it sometimes. It's that sexual ethics are theological minors, or side B versus side A, we have a minor difference between each other. And I would say no to both ideas. I think it's a myth. Sexual life is not my theological minor. It's not something that doesn't matter. I sort of think you can get this from the scriptures pretty easily, actually, if you engage the scriptures about what it means to live a holy life and how that's important. Sex does come up. It's not the only thing that comes up. Economic holiness, you might say, also comes up, and probably even to a
Oh,
greater extent.
it comes up a lot.
But it doesn't, I mean, both sexual holiness and economic holiness, for example, amongst other types of holiness, come up as part of living a faithful life to the living God. So sexual ethics are not theological minors by any count. And I and I know some side people won't say this, but I don't think it's important just to keep that straight. Not theological minors. Second, I think it's pretty clear for me that side B and side A have an irreconcilable difference. What is the moral evaluation of same-sex sex and same-sex marriage? And I'm unsympathetic to people usually who want to have this sort of position where they want us to unite more on our common queerness rather than have this dissension between ourselves around living a holy life with God as queer people. And I think that's intrinsically problematic, but that's also because I think being a Christian is more important than being queer if they're both important. It's just, yeah, just the nature of things. But we have an irreconcilable difference. And for me, to wallpaper over it, to pretend that it doesn't exist is just not living reality, but also not actually charitable. It's not actually a real way of living life because you don't pretend people aren't different in order to just make them in your own image. You recognize the difference and then you engage on that difference. So I think we're trying to engage on the real difference that actually exists with us. And of course, we are also similar. We're queer, for example, and we're sometimes the same age, we're from the same place, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, this reconciled difference really causes us to live differently. It causes us to think differently. It causes us to have different forms of discipleship. It causes us to have different relationships to the church. It causes us to engage different cultural contexts differently. There's so many differences from this one and related. There's other things, but just this key irreconcilable difference. And to pretend that it's not there, I think doesn't help anyone in truth. So
I think this comes up a lot for people who are coming out of, I'm most familiar with like evangelical Protestant Christianity and this kind of like very tight lines of the real church and the not real church.
Mhm.
And so people are thinking in terms of like it's one or the other. And
Yeah,
so it's like if it's a major theological thing, then they're a false church. If it's a
yeah.
theologically minor thing, then they can be part of here. And so it's and I don't talk to those people over there. I don't work with those people over there.
Mhm.
And I'm going to be meeting with a local pastor who's part of a progressive denomination. And
Mhm.
we're going to be talking about what it looks like. Are there opportunities to help neighbors start a coffee shop in the neighborhood for
Mhm.
the community and lots of fun ideas at a different time? But it's like, I couldn't be a member probably of their church because of this irreconcilable difference. But super excited to think about starting a coffee shop
Yeah.
and what that might look like.
Mhm. I mean, and
So
of course, we talk about this before. We're Christians. We can engage our ideological opponents because God calls us to love people and and have be peacemakers, etc. But it doesn't mean there's not boundaries at some times, and that doesn't mean that there's not boundaries in certain spaces. And that doesn't mean that the church should not try to be holy. Like all of those things can be true, and we can still engage our neighbors even when they differ
yeah,
from us. So,
and this habit of like theological minimalization, it creates this creep of like I'm comfortable with, I can take one step further and include gay marriage, and then you're like after a while that gets really comfortable, and then you're like, oh well, now I'm starting to hang out with all these people in polyamorous marriages,
yeah, and they seem
and
fine. They
like,
didn't seem that bad. Yeah,
they're normal people too.
yeah.
They're trying to love God, and they're thinking about this
Mhm.
biblically. And anyways, they can argue for why those positions are right, and that change happens incrementally as people expand their thinking. That is a reality. And so, of course, we can like change our views and stuff and have
Mhm.
conversation. But I'm just noting this tendency to not want to name things, and I feel we're people pleasers. We don't like being like it's not my disposition. I like
Yeah,
focusing on what we have common ground on, not our
I,
differences. And I'm trying
I think.
to gather up a little more, I don't know what the word is, a little more grit. I think we've had guests or I've seen on other podcasts where people are just like, oh, I disagree with that. And then move on. Just being able to name the thing where there's some opposition or disagreement. And
Yeah,
I just know I'm not as likely to do that.
sure, that is true. What else? I was going to say, but we recognize also the thing they're trying to avoid. They're trying to avoid when they kind of do this minimize minor difference sort of movement. They're trying to avoid like heresy hunters, people who just want to focus on everything and say it's all like so important that we have to destroy all relationships. The this is the absurd reduction. All destroy all relationships, just be our very pure selves and basically talk to no one.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously there's the opposite issue, but come on, there's a virtuous mean in the middle, people. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a way of avoiding the multiple wrong ways of doing this sort of thing. So,
And so that myth is something that we're saying, A, we're all kind of culpable to it in different ways. Side
two
B people
hints.
as well, of like, oh, I believe side B, but not trying to make it too big. And we're all
Mhm.
discerning how big it is.
Yeah.
But we do disagree that it's not just like a minor issue. And
Mhm.
we want to throw in a final, okay, those are the myths of side A, but a side B myth that I do think is more exclusive, not something we share as much with side A, but maybe it's like the inverse of if side A people think that side B people are sexually repressed, a lot of side B people will say, well, if you're side A in thought or in practice, then you don't know God and you don't have any spiritual life. You
Mhm.
are completely spiritually deplete. And we just
Mhm.
completely dismiss Christians who are side A. And because how in the world could they get this so wrong? And I think that's one of the things that stood out. Bill White, who we've engaged with before, recently had
not on an episode, but
not
this.
not yeah, sorry, not recorded, just
Mhm.
outside of recordings. There's a New York Times article that was sharing some of his journal entries that
Which we'll put
he
in the show
released his
notes.
son and his son
Yeah.
put together, and you just see the like very prayerful processing and thinking and wanting to honor God. Like he clearly has a spiritual life, and it is not for me to say that like he doesn't know God or he never knew God or he never could know God. Again, we just are really can be really prone to just wanting to like create our safe zones and be like, this is the right path and everybody's on the wrong path. And it's taken me a while to the Eastern Orthodox have been helpful to me, and just like there's a lot of mystery and just like God's the way that God is working and is present in outside the church and inside the church. As the Westminster Confession says, is like all churches throughout time are more or less pure. There's no perfect pure church, and but we can say that churches are more impure at different times, and we're responsible to. I
My
mean,
sensibilities around this will get different than yours, but yeah, I think it's wrong to say that he does not have a spiritual life, definitely, and that this implies him knowing of God. But I don't think that means that. I don't think that means that
it's of no
earnestness is.
spiritual significance.
Yeah, I don't think that means that earnestness is enough to be
Yeah.
faithful. I don't think that means that people heresy is not possible, that being heterodox is not possible. I don't think that means that people don't make wrong interpretive judgments in the world as Christians. Like, I think all of those are true. And yeah. And I don't and it seems like to me we still have a call. I don't think you think this too. We still have a call to try to encourage the church to teach the right thing. You know, you can be a
Yeah.
heresy hunter and engaging that idea, which is wrong. You can also just be faithful and engage in that idea. And yeah, he thinks the same. He has a ministry that's side A ministry basically, but he's trying to produce the change he thinks is
Yeah.
right in the world. So
Bill
yeah,
White.
yeah,
Yeah.
Bill White that is. Yep. So I mean, human beings try to make things that change the world in the way they think is right. Not surprising, but it doesn't mean that just because he's earnest doesn't mean he's right. In the same way, it doesn't mean we're right just because we might be earnest in some ways. Even though I think our life has a weight to it. Like we make a choice of a weight in a way that Bill White doesn't have, right? Even though he obviously has relatives who are queer, he has two gay sons, I think, but yeah, he doesn't have our lives necessarily as side B people. So yeah,
So, uh, maybe just as a little summary of where we've hit so far, uh, let me try to put these in kind of tight words. Myth number one was the repressed sexuality myth, or the celibacy is miserable myth. Myth number two is historical anomaly myth. Myth three is the unique marriage myth, or
yeah,
something like that. Special marriage myth. I don't know. Mono covenant myth, but that maybe sounds
yeah.
like something else.
It's funny.
Myth number four, the colonialist morality myth, or what did you call it, TJ? The noble savage myth,
Yeah, no, we're savage right
um,
here. Mhm.
which has its own problematic with its titling. But
Yeah, I know. It's still that's the term.
number five, personal morality myth.
Mhm.
Number six, genuineness is morality. And number seven, theological minor myth, or morality minor myth, something like that. So we hope that this episode was helpful. If there's anything that you think we missed, jump on Substack. There's a ability to have nice conversation threads on there. Love to hear your guys' thoughts. And there's probably areas where we were not clear or made kind of unconvincing summaries. And so I'd love to engage further. That's all. Yeah. Feel free to share this episode if you thought it was helpful at all. And if you want to support this podcast continuing, we're always welcome to just more patrons joining the crew. It's always an honor, and we really just cherish that support, without which, this stuff just wouldn't be possible to continue to build this work. So a little bit goes a long way with us.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye, TJ. Bye, y'all.
Bye, everyone.